Good evening, everybody. Welcome to all those who are joining us in the last event of the Kurlavarki Design Forum 2013. It's been really a very rich week for us all at the school. We've had visitors from all over the world, from Spain, from China, from UK, from India, and Peter has been on campus for the last few days from South Africa. And we've had the Kurlavarki Design Forum over the last 3 days, and it's been a wonderful gathering of students and architects from all over the country, teachers, all deeply immersed in their passion of architecture. And yesterday we had the Kurlavarki Memorial Lecture, where Professor Jaimini Mehta again was with us, and it was a wonderful thing to hear his views. And so this tradition of the school, which was set up after Kurlavarki's passing away, is growing ever richer. And I'm sure that all of you would like to come back, especially the panelists and other students who have come here. But today we thought we would come to a new place, not the school, and enjoy the riches around us in Ahmedabad. And Sarkej Roza is a much loved place for all who are working and studying here, for its wonderful sense of serenity, its tremendous social importance, and the fact that its architecture is so wonderful. And I think it's going to be a very good experience to listen to a lecture here. And the lecturer is Peter Rich, who comes from South Africa, and whose own interests cover the entire gamut of architectural study. He started his studies of African villages, and he has made wonderful drawings of the villages which give a sense of the life and the way in which the whole culture weaves an architecture out of it. And that understanding he carries into his work in South Africa and now in other parts of Africa and in other parts of the world as well, with a clear commitment to making an architecture which brings the community into a real relationship with nature and with each other, and with the idea of the craft and material all coming together in a manner in which the architecture transcends the place, but it is also of the place. We are very happy, Peter, that you have come to India, and I must warn you that this is a taste which is not easy to give up.
I know that.
And once you got it, the urge to return again and again to India, but especially to Ahmedabad, and more especially to the School of Architecture, that urge will pull you here all the time, and we'll be very happy to host you at any time.
Thank you.
But today, Peter, we would like to see your work and understand the ways in which you think.
Thank you.
Most welcome, Peter.
Thank you. I just want to thank everybody who's helped organize this, the students who've helped organize it, and with Raj, who brought me to the 361 conference, and then Chai, and just everyone I have contact with. This couple of years ago, I had the pleasure of meeting Anish Govendi and Ginja in Venice, and I don't know, when you meet certain Indians, it's just very special. And India's been a dream for me. I was invited to Bangalore last year, and it's just amazing. It's a place where magic happens, and somehow a drop of water on a leaf or light on a leaf is where God is. It's very far removed from the Christian Judaic sort of Anglophile background that one has from my particular, and Calvinist culture from my background. And they're definitely, when you come here, it affirms it. They say when you go to Africa, you're a changed being. I've certainly been changed by being born in Africa, but the same applies to India. I'm just going to contextualize for a moment. This is South Africa, a population of 47 to 50 million. By your standards, it's really small. It's very similar to your society in terms of layered complexities and conflicts. It's certainly not a social democracy. I love it because there's the potential to invent the new. You were linked to us at one stage and then drifted off from Gondwana land, and that's why when I'm in Johannesburg and I look at mountains from my office, they're 100 times older than the Himalayas, because they were there when India drifted off before it crashed into Asia and formed the Himalayas. And we also live in a very unique land. It's a land where there's all 5 biomes, and we have 10% of the world's plants by origin. We have more than the whole of Europe, Asia, India, China, from the Bering Straits to land end, including America. So we are the beginning of life, and until recent times, everybody thought, oh, well, maybe culture started in Europe, until just over here on a beach, they found something that's 70,000 years old, and culture also started at that point in time. So there's something special happening there as well. I taught for 30 years, and in 2007, I left the post of permanent teaching and started practicing. So I'm like a student. On Wednesday I turned 68. I've got sons that are half my age, and I feel their age, and I'm just a beginner. And it's a good place to be. And architects need never retire. The best architects I know are in their 80s. I mean, Doshi I met yesterday. We've got Gabriel Fagan in Johannesburg, who's 87. He's doing his best work, because you love what you do, and you should love what you do. I'm just referring here to the Egyptians were fascinated with the relationship of the Nile and the Milky Way. The fact that they paralleled one another led to them conceiving a time scale, and they looked at Orion, has a 25,000-year cycle of moving up and down the celestial Nile, and what that meant when it finally aligned itself with the pyramids. And what happens is you end up through the pyramids having a line at 31 degrees longitude, which is the longest length over any landmass, and in the other direction it's also the longest length over any landmass. And this is the Nile meridian. I'm not going to go metaphysically into it, but we're in a land here that's steeped in mythology, and I like to refer to this. I think it's wonderful. And it's interesting to note how many important archaeological settlements happen along this line. It starts with the Sphinx and it finishes with Gandhi's ashram. And remember, Gandhi's the other link. My wife's grandfather was the head of the mine that nurtured Gandhi through difficult times when he burnt his pass. So, and he was incarcerated, and the knowledge, his thoughts came from those times when he was in Africa and he was changed by Africa. So we have a lot in common. And I firmly believe, I'll finish this lecture, but I believe in the world we're going into, the world is a different place. They're looking to India, not China, to show the way. And you've got that, and I'm talking about economically, I'm talking about architecture, they're looking to the fresh and the new coming from Africa and Latin America. Those are the places where new thought is coming from. And your generation is going to be part of that. And what I want to try and do in this lecture tonight is make you proud to be Indians. You don't have to look across the seas anymore. I can't do this more than 2 times, and I'm an honorary fellow of the American Institute of Architects, and I know the good architects. I can't do that more than 2 times out of 300,000 American architects. So it used to be a good thing to go to Harvard and places. It's a different world we're actually in. I can do this, 100 times with Barcelona, and I'm starting to be able to do this with India as to good architects. And you've got past, your generation has got past the post-colonial thing where you have all the baggage of that. You need to move forward now and really believe in who you are, because the world is looking at you, and they're not looking to you to do architecture like the Northern Hemisphere magazines do. They're not interested in that. They're interested in something that's far more mythological, something that's far more visceral, something, and you have the advantage that you can do things with labor. I was in Australia recently, and I had students salivating. They wanted to actually come and work for one. They wanted to hold a brick. They wanted to jump into mud. Because their society has become so sophisticated that all they can make is prefabricated, slick materials. And they sort of lost the sense of smell, the sense of touch. And they sort of got themselves caught in a trap. You don't need to get there. These red spots are the areas. Remember, we were banned from the world until 1994. I interrogated the indigenous people here, and then went on to interrogate the people in Morocco. I went on to interrogate I've got to do a book, my son and I, on the Dogon of Mali. I'm working in Rwanda. I've interrogated that. I'm working in Ethiopia. And a lot of these tend to be on the line. And these are all the projects we've got that are happening coincidentally along this Nile meridian, which I find a fascinating concept. And when I went to the Rural Studio in America, Andrew Freer said to me, these kids actually think that Africa's a country. They don't know it's a continent. So you don't need to do this to you, but it is quite sobering to actually see that you can put China, India, Eastern Europe, the United States, all in France and Spain, all in that same area. And people say that by the year 2050, a quarter of the world's population will be living on that continent. It's going through its second range of imperialism. It's the Chinese, it's the South Africans, it's the Americans. Everyone's going in because the economy's gone up while the rest of the world's gone down. And it's busy being raped and pillaged at the moment. But then so is your culture, and what you as architects need to do is address that global onslaught, because it hasn't got to happen. Just placing me, when I was your age, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Heart Club's Band had come out, so that was the Beatles. That just places it. And I was an idealistic student at the time of apartheid. These students were having a peaceful rally, and a certain man happened to be present when the students threw stones at the cops. The cops opened fire, and Hector Peterson was killed. I'm starting this lecture with a project that's in process, and I'm finishing with one that's in process. It's just part of a dialogue. It's not the final thing, because I think we very often show finished work, and students need to understand that, it's a process. We say very clever things retrospectively about our work, but it is this process, and it's not always easy, and it's quite good when it's not easy. Sam Nzima has come to us, and he's asked us at the age of 70, he put 50,000 Rand on the table, which is probably 5,000 euros. And what he did is, he said, please would we help him celebrate this moment when he got the World Award, and this picture changed the course of apartheid, and it changed the course of happenings in the world. He never received any royalties, and in his lifetime we want to do a museum. And he was there when this man was shot. He was picked up, and we've been asked to tell the story of this. That's what a lot of things we do, is we tell stories. And it's amazing when you tell people stories, the compassion that you can develop, especially when they're people who've never been spoken to before. When he did take that photograph, he had the foresight to take the spool out and put it in his sock, because he knew the police would come and rip it out. And when it was published, they came to him and said, you pick up that camera, you're dead. So he had to give up his creative career, and he went to this environment near his hometown, and he became a businessman with a garage and a bottle store and selling tires. And it's near here that he's asked us, he's acquired a piece of land to do something, but he's also asked us to do something more special than that. He's asked us to do a place that is izibuko. It means, and I was explained today that the Muslim faith is something that's a journey and it's introspective. Well, this is the African equivalent of it. He doesn't just want it to be a photographic gallery. He wants people, the youth, to come there and to be introspective. And these are really crude computer drawings. I had a young guy in my office just before I came here, and I needed to keep him busy, and I just let him loose. But it does show you that Sam wants a camera as the entrance, a replica of his camera as the entrance. And he's 70, we're giving him a camera, okay? But you'll notice here, here's the void. Here's the diagonal extension. And you'll notice that you've actually got the courtyard. So this is called the Lapa in our language. And it's really a compound that's exploring those basic ideas. And there's a very crude thing. And what happens is you come in through here, you come into a high space that's vaulted. You've got the picture of the police and the students. While you're in there, a shot goes off. And you look through this, into this hall. You then go on an experience and you come back inside, and back to back you've got his two lives. So how do you start articulating these things? And then there's a series of drawings that take you in like that. And you paint this yellow, and the north sun comes in from the side, and this is where you tell the tragedy of that story. And on the other side of that wall is where you show the life he had to lead once his creative camera work was taken away from him by the police. But what you do is, here's a circular cabinet with his camera in it, and next to it will be a facsimile of a policeman, because he was denied access to that camera. It's one way of telling the story. It's part of an ongoing conversation. It might not end up like this, and you could just build this one little building depending on whether you've got money or not. Then let's talk about the sky room. The courtyard is a sky room, and Terrell people discovered it long after other cultures. And when you get to this main space that's at the back here, in African cultures you have a circular house, and when someone dies you let the roof cave in, and at the back you have the Nsama, which is the seat of the ancestors, which is related to the crocodiles, which is related to water. And when you're in that room, you've got a circular space open to the sky, and that's how you play reverence to your ancestors. I put this in because this was the start of activism. I was an Olympic athlete, and I was 6th in the world, but we were banned, and I supported the sports boycott against South Africa. So it taught me the pain of being an activist, and it was a very necessary thing to do, and I've been an activist ever since. And you need to be activists. When you go into your city of Ahmedabad and you suddenly hear that there's a FAR of 5.6 around, which means in the old city you're going to get 26-story buildings just out of the greed of developers, you need to go as students banging on the door of your Institute of Architects and ask them what the hell they're prepared to do about it. And if they took this, you need to take it even further, and you need to even riot on the streets, because you need to actually become an activist. I didn't go to Rome. Instead of throwing police bombs at the police, petrol bombs at the police, I decided, guided by Pancho Guedes, who was my surrogate architectural father, to go and document the indigenous people's cultures. And in doing that, don't take any anthropologists, don't take any other disciplines, don't take any other agendas. Just go and measure it up, because it's going to disappear under the iniquities of the social engineering of apartheid. And I learnt almost everything you can learn by going to Rome, by being with these people. This woman, through personal adornment, has responded to the axiality of her body and the dualities that she has, and how she actually has to dress herself accordingly. And it comes through in the architecture. Here's the construct by Leonardo. This woman's illiterate. Her mother's illiterate. She's coming out, and she's a little bit like she's potent with fertility, and she's coming out like the caterpillar and the chrysalis. She's revered as the carrier of life, but she's fettered through the beadwork because she has to be accepted into the community as this changed form of being, which is a woman and a childbearing woman. She's been in a month of seclusion according to the lunar calendar with her grandmother and mother. And then there are the beautiful buildings at the back that people design. And you'll notice here that woman, it's as though from every time when a young girl has a period after her first menstruation, they have a ceremony to celebrate, and they invite their friends and they decorate. And she's become a good architect. She's got involved with sculptural embellishments, sculptural freestanding sculpture, personal adornment, and the adornment of buildings graphically. And through doing that often, she's become very good. And it's as though she had Palladius Quattro Libri next to her. She knows how to take a building under the vastness of the African sky, and through creating a podium, give it presence in that setup. And the divine systems of proportion, there's golden section, she's got all that knowledge. And she's also got a profound sense of maths. When you go into a settlement, you notice straight away there's a scruffy building that guards the cattle, okay? And it guards the entrance, because the man's the carrier of the seed. The woman's the carrier of life. Here you have a polygamous situation, first wife, second wife, third wife. There's a pecking order, and if you're from a different ethnic group, the pecking order is different. So when you come in, you know straight away that's the first wife. Look at the agreement as to gable ends, as to hip ends. You break the code over there because that one daughter has become a shaman and a witch doctor because she has special healing powers, and she gives expression in that particular way. And then notice the diagonal extensions that start happening spatially. And when you read Yatten's book on kinetics, you walk in formally, but what you do is you actually get this idea of the village. And I coined the word that a house is not a home in an African sense unless it's a village, which I'll expand upon. And when you don't have money, you just use charcoal and lime wash, and you have this ordered set of courtyards which has a frontality to it. Why? Because the ritual space of the men deferring to the women is here, and the ritual space of the women is over here, and the home is the womb. And these women they do what architects do. They say, we see what we want to see and we make it our own. Now they went into the villages in and around, colonial South Africa. There was Art Deco buildings, there were balls on top of gateposts that were Victorian because the British came and stole our gold and diamonds and had a war with us. And yet all our structures, a little bit like India, are still beholden to being British, and we've benefited from it, so we've gone through that whole thing. But they saw a chocolate box with a Cape Dutch house on it, and they made it an entrance. They walked out and saw a public building in Pretoria, going there by train, and they did something. An American car of the 50s with fins went past. That became another idea. And that's what architects do. But what's important is not to copy. It's through the reinterpretation that you give it new symbolic meaning, because it becomes personal, because it's rooted in your context and your mythology. And that's where, when you're given the lessons that you're given by your mentors, and you go out and look at fantastic things that have got to do with Indian space making, be it this ancient civilization or the poles in the city or whatever, it's how you transfer that knowledge into its application to a contemporary thing. Because what you're doing in a contemporary sense has no longer the mythology underpinning that you do this, as do the poles. It hasn't got the lifestyle. But it's the lessons you can learn, and you've got to actually make that transition. And I also got quite intolerant of the limitations of an Anglophile Christian Judaic mindset, which is very arrogant. You know, we play cricket, we right, everybody else is wrong. Okay? You play cricket and you don't have that attitude. I suddenly realized that Africans have a different sense of space. To them, the wild veld out there is a place of danger, but it's also a place of fertility. And when I started looking at their drawings and doing drawings of their settlements, I started realizing all the simple lessons that are in Yatin and other people, and Nikki Desai and Chai and everybody's books. The threshold of entry that you come in here and you go through a transition phase and then you go into another one, into a more public space. That's a universal. The idea of how you deal with rainwater, the idea of how you're resourceful. Peasant cultures are the true sustainable cultures. They're disappearing because they require a high degree of maintenance, but that's being interrogated. I've been across the world to see Baragan. We had Baragan in our backyard. Nobody knew. And it's really just the paints that were left over from a painting job they probably did on a European farmhouse. But there's a resourcefulness. And there's a sense of scale. I learnt about scale, and it's all related to Corb's modular, but it all had to do with measuring what human beings do. And how good is a courtyard, because you can just get up with your backside and move it, and you can find shade or sun or whatever you need. It ventilates well in the hot climate, and it traps the heat in the warm climate. They're simple things. It's not this far-fetched notion of what things can be. And then the beauty, and then the transference of culture. Why is this so clean? This African woman's gone and worked in a Calvinist kitchen, a good Afrikaans woman, where cleanliness is part of their life. So there's the borrowing of it. And also when we get into the ritual practice of these people, it's driven by Indians from India who made Africa their home ground, because as entrepreneurs and as traders, they understand that they can feed and nurture what that is. A book's got to be written about that. This is a shaman. I had a lot of Africans who were a bit confused by the art world. They called it Palm Beach. They did things for religious reasons, and suddenly they had the arty-farty world wanting to take ownership of their stuff and sell it for huge prices, and they wanted to spread a message and weren't interested in that. And I'll show you why I referred to this guy. This is Jackson. He occupied a hilltop which was an Iron Age site 2,000 years ago, and he altered it to be a religious site along Christian lines. There was the altar of God here, and the altar of Christ here, and there was Christ's office there, and there was the beginning and the end, and Golgotha, and there was up and down and cutting in, but he was carving a hillside. And he became someone who I became a patron to. And he was a shaman. He told me 3 years before Mandela's release, the day that Mandela would be released. And he was someone who had profound knowledge in one way or another. It's a lecture in itself. And I helped him erect the aerial of God, because he said, thought is prayer, and I just need this aerial, even though it's not connected to any electricity, because I can just sit and I can beam my message. So you cross paths with these wonderful people. And he influenced when I started building my own house. Now remember, under apartheid, you in principle didn't do any work for the apartheid government, so you built your own house, you did little holiday houses for friends, and you were teaching at the university. This has to do with a house and garden, but there are lessons from it. 1918 house, looking the wrong way, faces the street, because that's what the British made you do, but the sun moves in that path, and then you get all the bad alterations. So you buy it and you alter it, and you start exploring the idea of putting a cottage in your former driveway and garages over here, and you define forecourt, and then you define entrance court, and you define back court, and you define inner zen courts. And I coined the word that a house is not a home unless it's a village. And these were ideas I was borrowing from the Ndebele, because I was there, and there was the idea of a diagonal extension running through, and this became the office, which was the old part of the house facing. And over the past 35 years, we've been weaving these ideas. And there were the ideas of the Ndebele. A house, and then you build 2 side rooms, defining a veranda, and then you enclose make place by putting this, and you reinforce the place, and so you have incremental growth. And how could one actually apply that? And there was the idea of basically using the same roof, which you extended. And these were the palaces of illusion that a woman did in her beadwork, and when she does beadwork, she does the most advanced maths to get that beadwork going. And then this is a drawing of the site. So Jackson was carving a site, I was carving a site, we're still carving the site, and there's the business of placemaking in and around the house, which has a lot of ideas of Adolf Lewis's round plan in it. So you can run these ideas concurrent, because that's where your headspace was in 1978. I don't do buildings like that anymore. But the gardens become this pursuit of, it's not built on money, it's built on love. We actually just don't buy nursery plants. We get a slip from someone and nurture it. My wife does the planting. I do the stonework. The bowl comes from India. This is how, when we have money, we build. And we start making our own world. And we start extruding the landscape, we start carving the landscape. It has to do with placemaking. And we get unemployed people off the street who we train and give a skill, and when they've got a skill, we teach them how to cost it, and then we market them through the institute to other architects. And there's the grain hollowed out through years and years of grain, which is sacred, but we use it for the birds. And then there's the subtle thresholds of entry, and there's the jacaranda trees, which came from Mexico, because the British seeds came in the horse feed for the British when they were fighting a war against us. And then we go into the interior of the house, and my wife is about porcelain and refinement and floating daisies, and I'm the sort of rough guy, and that's why we get on so well together. And then there's the importance of the floor plane, there's the importance of the ceiling. Don't underestimate the ceiling. And the things that you collect. I like houses that are autobiographies of your home. Palladio, and endorsed by Van Eyck, said a house is not a home unless it's a city. What they meant was that it's layered with the stories of who you were. When you get into interior design, very often you're called upon to give people who have no imagination what they see and aspire to in a magazine which has nothing to do with who they are. I think successful houses can actually take the belongings which are part and parcel of your story, and how you demarcate the threshold from one end to the other. Now, you as a generation of architects, you have in the recent past seen all the superstars who do these crazy non-contextual buildings, Gary and Stephen Hall and Rem Koolhaas and you name it. That's easy stuff to do. It's wow architecture, and you sort of think, well, wow, if I want to be really good, I need to do that. That time has passed. That indulgence just due to economics is past. We're in a different era, and there's 96% of the world who actually needs you. There's the people who need you most. So your generation is going to be looked to actually deal with that. You know, the 40% of Indians who don't have access to sanitation. And that's a whole, and it's a far more rewarding thing to do. Then we did Little Jewels. This is where we have a holiday house, a beautiful little house built for next to nothing. And it's an interesting plan because it has 3 pavilions linked by a veranda which flares up to make an entrance, a morning deck and afternoon deck. The kitchen's part of this space. It's braced by an intermediate thing here. We don't build with wood in South Africa. We don't have a timber tradition, but this is an oddity. And so it became new. But what it does is it also has saddlebags of space, service and serve spaces. We learned that from Khan. But it also becomes a reinterpretation of spatial lessons learned from the Ndebele. Okay? And it's a different thing. And I want to show the students who did my exhibition. On Monday, I want to meet with you. I want to show you if we configure those screens differently, we can end up making positive space rather than just a closed space that closes in on itself by using this idea of the checkerboard. Okay? So, you know, this is already transcribing what did I learn from those people. I'm not some guy who's getting all over romantic about tribal architecture. I'm actually saying it has application spatially to a clever way of using things. And then a lot of architecture is involved with abstraction. I always use the example of, without offending any nationality, of how Dutch architecture up to Herman Hertzberger followed a tradition. And then it dealt a lot with profound abstraction. We've got to put the human factor back. And we just put, because this house had no amenity other than the view of a saddle of a hill, you put a dormer window in, the complexity that introduced, and there was enough abstraction. Then there's another house. A client bought a site where you looked at Africa putting its feet in the sea. We learned from the Japanese that the eaves overhang and the idea of framing views. A framed view is much more, the Japanese have the saying that you've got to capture a view alive. And that view becomes more special with the building there than it does when the building's not there. And then how do you transcribe it into a building? Okay? So, again, learning from another culture, because they've refined that way of looking at it, middle ground, foreground. It's what you do when you take a good photograph. You frame a view. But eaves and that are the way you do it. And then when one has a look at the house, the fact that when it gestures down to the sea, it steps down 400, because it gestures down. If you take it straight out, it slaps up at you. And when you're in the kitchen, the idea of diagonal extension. So the diagonal extension comes from the underbelly. You can build a whole career just out of that one idea. And another client who has ordinary taste, it's not profound, but she went to Mali and got some nice African prints. And it's okay, And you designed some light fittings that were the sort of light fittings that Adolf Loos would have done, because they're parchment and they give a nice light. And then I challenge you, you must all as young architects do a modernist piece at one point in time. Get hold of the Smithson's discourse on what is a modernist, heroic modernist architecture, and then make a list of it and then tackle it. It's so difficult because you don't have decoration. And this was a client who had a lot of money. She was the director of a platinum company, and she wanted a place to entertain her friends. She had a swimming bath she never used, and she had this idea of turning the deep end into a wine cellar, which ventilated. A bit of indulgence, but you're teaching at university and you're looking for a pretext to explore something. It has the idea of architectural promenade in it, and it's... And then you start making connections. Why did you do classical architecture? That's Philibert Delorme, because you realize that when you take that channel there, which is only 75 millimeters deep, without that upstand, it looks aesthetically weak. And that's exactly what happens when you look at those orders, or when you look at the orders when you go around this building here. So suddenly it started to make sense. And you're always learning. You students think you get to Chai my age that you know all the answers. Chai, whenever he gets really stressed as head of department, his therapy is he says, I'm a student. And then he just calms down. It's fantastic. And you need to actually do that. And then there were a whole series of projects, come 94, where you could relate to communities. You could suddenly start designing for the people that your researcher tried to prepare you for. You explored the qualities of thatch. You took the idea of the circular hut and adapted it to having a toilet and things. You provided venues near game parks where the local community could meet visitors like yourself from overseas, cook local food, perform plays, interact with them, and you started pulling upon the ingredients that you'd learnt, the ritual spaces that you'd learnt from culture, the way the fireplace is made and you can flush the water out, the way a courtyard's made, the way the veranda is something that was borrowed from the Europeans. And why was it borrowed from the Europeans? Because governors came to India and developed the bungalow, and then they went to New Zealand, and then they went to South Africa, and when it was tropical in South Africa or Nairobi, they'd used the bungalow idea. So there's a whole crossover of ideas, which is wonderful. And then this is the hotla, which is just some poles, some trees with branches on top, which is a place to sit in the shade. And when you go to Mexico, it has a different name. It's called the Ramada. So you suddenly realize there's a whole number of universals. And then here is this idea of taking short little sticks across corners and repeating them on a room that's 3 meters by 3 meters, which is what the Dogon did. So I had a Dogon transfer to something that was on the Botswana border. So I'm just trying to show you that you intelligently do that. And I got the local woman to come and sit here with their African backsides to get the shape of the seat right, because they were going to do the sitting there. And a woman's backside's highly prized. It's very different to a Western ideas. And how do you collect water off? And how do you make water? But this also had to do with taking a man into the mountains and getting 5 people and making piles of stone and then timing how long it took, getting him to hire a trailer, then loading it on the trailer and bringing it to site and saying, now, I'm teaching you how to do a contract. How much you want to make some money, we'll add a percentage on. But when I'm not here, you can be the person but you must know how to price the material that you have to bring to site. So what you do is you suddenly engage and you become part of the maker, which is the advantage you in the developing world have over the developed world. You don't get that chance in the developed world anymore. It's just too expensive to do it. Sorry. And this particular one, here we got hold of some unemployed people as part of a British grant, and trying to get the pointer. And we built this building from scratch out of soil cement. That's 5% cement, hand-pressed tiles. We started a brick industry. We empowered the people. Then there were major floods, and then we got a bigger brick industry because we had to make what Americans call the wash, when we put 15% cement in it. So we empowered a whole lot of people, and we built this little building. And what was nice, it had a tree here. In terms of its orientation, it just had cross ventilation, which is all that's how the people lived traditionally, so it's not alien to them. And through creating this walkway, we created a number of additional buildings that moved along. We did a beautiful idea for a hotel, which was, Europeans come and they pay thousands of dollars to seduce one another in a nice space and stand naked watching elephants. And, you must make it nice for them, And when they're making love on this bed here, the center of the circle must be right over their belly so they get their chakras jigged or whatever. And then I'll spend a little bit of time on this building. This is a lot of the future where we're going to be building. And this is a fantastic project. It's got caught in politics, but it's part of it. If you're going to build, it's difficult. And it's not easy, and you must be prepared for the fight. Okay? And if you're swimming against the tide, it's going to be even more difficult. And what I did here is Mandela lived in a room over there, and we won the contract to look at heritage. We were the first people. The laws of South Africa were, the British laws. If a building's 60 years old, you conserve it. And we said, but these are Africans. It's got nothing to do with age. If we go and interrogate them, we find that, the fact that Mahatma Gandhi stayed in a shack over here and Samora Machel stayed there and the gang was here, there are activities and events that are important to them. And what you've got to do with other cultures is if you're going to design in them, and that's why I went and worked with other people, try and find out what their daily and their ritual practice is. Try and find out what their language is. In Rwanda, we found out that front door means family. Because those nuances, and just the time that I've been here eating Gujarat food and been in people's homes, there are all sorts of nuances which are very particular to how you make space in your places in a respectful and enabling way. So what I did is I went with a measuring tape, and I measured up this entire area. There's something wrong with the computer. It should be sharper, because I measured every bed, every washing line. These are the defensible spaces that people make. And what happens is you get a courtyard of 10 families with a control point at the entrance. The government wants to wipe this up because it wants to build horrible prefabs that will turn everyone into drug addicts. But, you've got to actually fight it. And then what did I do? I learned that the negative space of the courtyard became the footprint of the building. And there's the building. We acquired 2 sites. They were occupied by shack dwellers who were given a better life, in fact free accommodation, which was brokered with them. If you went into a tent and a holding situation, you got a better house. There were politics around that. It was a little like that. And Mandela lived in that room, and he said, please don't tell my story. It's been told ad nauseum. Tell the story of the people. And don't just tell their story of struggle. Tell the wonderful story of hope and the wonderful outcomes, the jazz musicians. And Africans are like that. They don't actually want to go and build a Holocaust museum or something. They don't want to build an apartheid museum. The sun comes up, and they want to move on. The youth are not interested in it. The Apartheid Museum in South Africa is for Northern Europeans and Americans. And there's a drawing of, a 3D drawing of, and what we did here is it's the idea of street. You recognize that steps become an amphitheater. So if you're dealing with the street, how can you actually do it? The ramp that actually comes up and comes into the space, and you come here, the Centre Pompidou does it. You get a view of it, you then come down the staircase and in, and you visit Mandela, and then you visit the courtyards. And the training of people as to what does it mean when visitors come with cameras and stick them into your lives. You've got to learn to deal with tourism. Tourism can be used as a vehicle, but it can also be very, very destructive. And then you become friends with the people, and when someone dies, you get invited. I'm coming back on a double-decker bus from a funeral. The person lies in state. It's a mixture of Old Testament, New Testament, and their own belief. And, belief is very strong in South Africa. I've been to a church of 10 million Christians, and my wife and I were the only European people present. But it's gone through that syncretic thing that religion, the Christian faith goes through, and it wasn't a destructive force because the paradigm of it was not that different from what was there, whereas in Papua New Guinea and places it was very destructive. So you become friends with the people, and then how do you develop an appropriate language? I'm with shack dwellers, I'm with people who are urban scavengers who take everything that's thrown away to make their houses. Okay, and that's the context you're in. They phoned me up on cell phones and said, we love the building, but what we did is we built a jungle gym out of steel, and then we trained the people to do all the infill work. When this building was stopped for 3 years because there was a fight between two government agencies, not a brick was stolen. A similar building in Cape Town was demolished in 3 months because the people had a sense of ownership and pride because they helped build it and they learned skills and they were properly paid. And why does the stonework have black on it? Because that's what people in the rural area do, and you get a lot of rural people that come in here. I've been in my class telling people about a six-story, 6 blocks of the city of Johannesburg with property that was owned unusually by Indians under Jan Christian Smuts before apartheid, and they were allowed to remain, very unusual. And since we've become a democracy, they've completely transformed that area. As Muslims, they've embraced African Muslims, who the men are the sewers. They've got these textile industries underneath. They've turned one of the apartments into Muller. The building is designed by Kallenbach, who was Gandhi's architect. It works socially very well. The grannies can police the place. They can make their samosas. It's the most incredible example of how community has taken positive action. They can defend illegal Pakistanis who have no bank. They can bank their money and get beaten up. They've dealt with the social situation, and they've very beautifully embraced Hindus. And what's important is people from Indian villages have brought their village into the city. So you get the village in the city. You get this wonderful transference of things happening. So the values we're looking at here are part and parcel of that. Okay. Then I'm going to talk about Mapungubwe. I had 2 chances. Well, it's really we're a small practice. I've got my 2 sons. We were never more than 8. When we won the World Building of the Year at WAF, and Kanga Kuma came and gave me a hug and he whispered in my ear, stay small, not like me. And we've intentionally done that because I don't want to employ staff to do what I enjoy doing well, and we also want to learn to say no. Now, you've done a building, and you try to do an appropriate architecture that people love in a squatter camp. Now you get an opportunity here. There's a site where, in the 9th to 12th century, you had the kings occupying this highland with the proletariat occupying the valley floor, the southernmost example of class distinction in the South African context. Okay? In 1927, certain people from zoologists and other people from Pretoria University were called, and they noticed there was this gold rhino. It's got a single horn, which means it could be an Indian rhino, but it's very politically uncool to even suggest that. And then there's Ming pottery, there's beadwork, and there's also evidence that there was technological and artifact exchange with Malaysia, China, India, Persia. And when you look at the Renaissance in Europe and you see Africans with turbaned heads, they're not slaves, they're traders, because there was the kingdom of gold in Africa, and Renaissance gold is from Africa. And remember, your gold, you seem to have more gold than anybody in the world because every woman seems to be dripping with it. And you know, you had this relationship with South Africa, you know, and when you look at the genetic strain in our dogs and all sorts of domestic ways, and gold in these ancient cultures was poured the way it's poured in southern India. The word Bantu, I believe, is a lot of the linguistics come from southern India. So there's an umbilical cord that just due to trade winds linked us. And there's sacred sites all over South Africa. It's very contentious as to whether they're African or Indian. So this is the site. We were part of a national competition, and there are 3 countries here. It also was it had a terrible history during the apartheid era. It's one of the most sort of the SS type group that you get with the Nazis in the war. There was a group here where all gays and drug addicts were sent to be knocked into shape to go to the front line of our war in Angola. South Africa had its Vietnam, exactly the same story, but we won't go there. My sons fortunately haven't had to fight in a war. I taught the students that fought in that war and they were damaged. That's another story. And what we did is, so you've got that horrible story, but you've also got agreement between these 3 countries to take the fences down so that the game can roam. So you've got a good outcome. South Africa is a place of 20 good stories and 20 bad stories. And it's still a magical place. And there's the top of a hill. It's a predecessor to the Great Zimbabwe culture, which has a lot of mythology around it. And one knows that what Africans do when they walk in the veld, they mark the way with piles of stones. And we also know that from the 9th century to the present, if you interrogate it properly, there's 17 different ethnic groups that have coexisted with one another across the spectrum of Bantu cattle culture. And Bantu cattle culture is where your wealth is cattle, and when you want a girl in marriage, the whole negotiation is done of engagement and marriage through the number of cattle. So, you know, if a girl's really beautiful, she's worth 1,000 cattle. And this is the grinding of very fine maize, which was there. And what we did is, because there were land claims in this area, and a lot of them were dubious, we couldn't resort to my reference of anything being explicitly or overtly having an African particular tribal connotation. So we met and we decided we're going to look at nature, and we're going to try and design a building that's devoid of style, devoid of fashion, and it was authentic and is entirely reliant upon the forces of nature, and its materials are reliant upon nature's force, what nature gives to you. Because you're housing gold, you can't put gold in a thatched hut. It sort of doesn't make sense. One looked at how do you approximate the cave, and these are drawings of caves in Namibia. And the clues were there if you're prepared to just listen. My son Robert, who I'm going to bring to SEP to teach because he's a fantastic teacher, and I think he'll become a Hindu if he comes here. He did his undergraduate thesis working with botanists from Pretoria University. And he did it on 7 pavilions in a National Botanical Garden that communicated through the design of the building and the exposition the intelligence and emotions of plants. And it's the most unbelievable field to explore. Plants are intelligent. It's another story. So we came and we listened and we looked. And we learned from the botanists that when you've got a plant, it doesn't just grow a branch because it, wants to wave at another good-looking tree that's nearby or something. It does it for business reasons, okay? It does it for reasons of counterforce or whatever. And it's very economic about it. So there's no wastefulness in what happens. And there's the baobab tree. It has double intelligence because the intelligence is in the roots and it has roots in the air. And we also started realizing that we actually had particular types of visceral materials that we would like to reflect. We were near 2 great rivers. 70 buses descended on the sacred site. With a bulldozer, and then the National Parks Board, who's taken over this area, pulled them back to a facsimile of the site, and this is my drawing of it. And what our brief was that this was the site we were given over here, which is on the south side of a hill. This is the road to Zambia. You come into the park entrance here, and quite close by, you park on the side of this hill, you walk in, down across a wash, and in the building you rise 11 to 14 meters, and then you walk around, you look at the sacred Mapagubi Hill in the distance, and then you come back and then you actually visit it. And the underlying order, we made equilateral triangles, because the equilateral triangle is something you find in the Shangaan and Venda cultures in the area. 3 round houses linked by a courtyard. You also find it on the mountain. You also find it in the stars. And you've also got to allow your intuition to guide you. So there's a sort of order to it. But basically you're zigzagging up, and you're rising up 1.5 meters, and then you're going up another 3.5 meters and another 3.5 meters. And it's how you imperceptibly, even in a wheelchair, can actually negotiate the site. This is John Uschendorf. He's a professor at MIT. He looks like an MIT nerd, doesn't he? And he's holding the bathroom chain. He was made one of America's Young Geniuses MacArthur Award several years ago. That's my discussion with him on the blackboard. Due to a most unbelievable set of circumstances, it was like me thinking, how am I going to build a cave? And the next thing, Professor Chaya walks into my life and tells me, he happens to be in Johannesburg. This happened to be a man called Izzy Benjamin, an ex-South African who's lived in London for many years, and he says, Peter, you arrived on the right day, and he said, you've got to connect with this young American who went and stood on the roof of King's College Chapel, said, how does this stand up in Cambridge, UK? And went and interrogated that there were over 1,000 buildings in America, because what happened with this construction technique, it's 700 years old. It's from North Africa, which the Moors took into Spain. Gaudi and his fellows picked up on it. And a certain man called Guastavino moved to America in the early part of the 20th century, 1903. And he started patenting a system of building, and Grand Central Station and another 1,000 buildings are built that way, without steel, without cement, and they've lasted to this day. So he started interrogating it, and he trained a couple of young people, and we started, and what we did is we started looking at the potential of it in both directions. We tried to see if we could site it so as not to hurt the land. And I started doing some drawings as to what these interiors could look like. And the aesthetic, we were trying, all aesthetic decisions had to do with how nature's forces were distributed, how you deal with stone cladding. We didn't want anything to be some whimsical, and even the steelwork, we wanted it to come from inspirations from the way nature grows. And we got hold of unskilled, unemployed women, and with this press, which goes on the back of a pickup, we managed to make tiles that were 18 millimeters thick by 130 by 100, and we taught them how to cure them with 5% cement. 3 MPa, we tried to see how weak we could do it, and we had the Research Institute at MIT and the Research Institute at Cambridge in the UK and my university all working with this, and then we got these guys who were also unemployed, and we built these little vaults. And you talk about throwing architectural students in the deep end, we started building. This is Michael Ramage, who is now a partner in Light Earth Designs. We just registered a company in England. And we realized that when we do future projects, we're going to have to be the subcontractor and not just train. We're going to have to finish it. So we're going to become like a Eladio de Est. And it'll be a chance of getting your hands dirty. And there's a lovely student of yours who's dead keen to come and learn how to build vaults. And there's James Bellamy from New Zealand. He happened to build vaults in the south of England with some Catalanese. He's a vegan, very nice, kind guy. And he went and found a local team, and he visited all of their homes, and he built up this wonderful working relationship. And with very few supports, just timber taken from the site, we started building, and we could span 22 meters. You know, you've got to be adventurous and a little bit crazy, because it helps. And And we had professional indemnity insurance from Cambridge University, which sort of impressed the client no end, but it was a first timer. And when we started building, and this is the way we used one row of tiles as permanent shuttering to throw a concrete floor. As soon as your hyperbolic paraboloid gets wide, you've got to put tie rods in. And this is how meetings were resolved. My partner, who's from England, he came with the RIB plan of work and all that, and I just tore it up and said, look, forget it, buddy. You're going to resolve problems around a beer and a meeting, and it's going to happen very, very differently in Africa. And that's how we worked. And there are the tiles. So what you do is you're building with soil from the site, no transport costs, and you're also removing the stone that's on the surface, which you're going to put back onto the building. And what we're doing is we're starting to build buildings in landlocked countries, which have to bring materials across corrupt countries, and everything costs 5 times the price. And we're proving that you can do all sorts of things. And all the clues were there. We had a main contractor who couldn't even use a dumpy level. I had to have someone permanently on site to guide the process. And the palette that one looked at, you wanted something that had a complete congruence with what was happening. And also the thing of scale. You see a giraffe and then you see an elephant, and then you talk to your partner and you don't see it. It's gone behind a bush. So how could you have a building that was not about form? It was maybe about an extension to landscape. The brickwork was so shocking because no one was trained in brickwork. It had this dribble with the mortar, and I tried to fantasize that maybe we could get it to look like the baobab tree, but the client said no. And we did a negotiation where the steelwork I could paint with an anti-rust so it looked rusty. But you realize you were suddenly dealing with the skin, you were dealing with the wharf and the weft, and the irregularities of the homemade is what gave it the feeling of the ancient. And we just got goose pimples when we went to site because it was so much better than we ever could imagine it was. And where you had a free-flowing form, a free-flowing shell, it was like a billowing sail. There's one that's free-flowing. It didn't float. It sort of billowed like a sail of a ship. So there were qualities starting to come to grips. And the son of an electrician actually said it in Afrikaans. He said, Dad, it looks like a seed's being planted and it's grown, which was the best compliment we had. When you go into the sacred, you usually go into dark space. It takes Johanni Pelasma to remind us about that in his writings in Encounter. It also takes Johanni to remind us that the staircase is to architecture what the spine is to the body. But we forget about that. We hide it in high-rise buildings. The staircase, you can teach architecture just through staircases. But when you go into a space like this, when you make, you can see how beautifully this Sufi have managed to moderate light through their screens. We got polycarbonate from Australia, which was made by Bayer of Germany, because ours was not good enough product. And we shut down the UV value. And then what we did is we took sticks that were part of a poverty relief program, taking sickle bos out, and put them in the corrugations on both sides. So you shut it down and shuttered down the light until you got the right effect. And the building has that ambiguity of scale where there's no reference to a normal door, so you don't know what size it is. And it's a little bit like Ronchamp. It sort of seems much bigger, but it's actually small. It has that, and one tried to, that ambiguity was something that was captivating. The other thing is just ordinary people love it. Truck drivers would stop and run in and say, what's going on here? They don't need some intellectual discourse on what it's all about. And then there's also the modernist idea that comes in. But there are two ingredients. One's your cave, and the other ingredient is slatted light. And slatted light is for nothing. You know, these sticks are waste products that are from poverty relief programs. The decision to go for galvanized pipes instead of gum poles was that there was a galvanizing plant 2 hours away, and the contractor was from there, whereas the big city was 6 hours away. And the stonework was the only real skill you had, because the people, you can look at the architecture, the archaeological record, and it's loose packed. So it's great fun to take kids to the museum and put a hose on it, because snakes and scorpions and all sorts of things come out of it. The reception area, how do you, with just the mesh you've got to put in the surface bed, when you don't, if you try and actually take the money away and you have to improvise, you just come up with better ideas. And a mild steel flat, and then you realize that 3 intersecting circles were so much part of Venda and Shangaan culture anyway. So how do you use references but use them in another way? And then when you go inside, it has the feeling of being carved. And what can an oculus do? And when we look at the last project, which is the Women's Centre we're on, we're exploring the idea of the oculus with a spiral, descending spiral, being the potential way to display those embroideries in the Women's Museum. And we're exploring it in a different light. And the exhibition comes in, and does your building hold the exhibition? We weren't part of that. And how do you reflect water off a pool that's just 150 millimeters deep, so that when you walk through the space you get dappled light of the reflections, and which animals start and toads and that start occupying that space. And then you look in the distance at the museum, and you go up on at the distant hill, and you walk back, and you need a 40-watt globe to illuminate a big vault. You don't need too much light. All of you in your architecture start forgetting about putting downlighters in. Just start looking at light. Go to Europe and go into some of Adolf Loos's spaces and have a look with an ordinary naked globe that he conceals from view with a piece of parchment, how he makes a beautiful light. And lighting is so important. You can't have architecture without it. This is Victor Makwevo. He's happy, and his wife. He's learnt a skill. He's earned some money, and his daughter's learnt about their ancient culture, and she cracks the whip and they go on. And at the opening ceremony, this lady with her entourage came along, and that's how Africans perform. Westerners would say, you know, why is she topless? She's topless because she's proud to be a woman, and that's how she asserts herself in her culture, and we're having to reconcile that we have these multicultural things happening. Up the road, we have a day visitor center for the meeting of the chiefs of the local area. They want to look across at Mapungubwe because it's sacred to them, and when we have a new president, he gets ordained with the... So the point I'm talking about is, you know, I'm an African with a French Huguenot Anglophile background with some African blood in me according to my DNA, and you get called upon for another culture to do something that's iconic and important to them, like this building. Where do you start? Okay? And these are my sketches. And these are ablution blocks for people who don't know about toilets. It's a very good idea to make the walls that ventilate. And I learned that from an idea I saw in the Dogon, where they make walls that ventilate. So again, it's a crossover of cultures. And gum poles, because we inherited gum poles from eucalyptus from Australia for the mines. It's become part of the culture, and you build that way. And then again, there's the sacred Nsamo, the circular hut with the roof taken off, with the sacred seat at the back, with the shadows falling on it as a place of contemplation. They're very simple gestures. We trained people in welding. We didn't know how to weld ourselves, so we had to learn first. And when the money's taken away and the gestures are simple, it's just so much easier. And unfortunately, we're not in South Africa part of the ridiculous codes of health and safety that have happened in the developed world, because you couldn't do that in Britain because a child might climb up it and fall over the edge. Then we move to Geralto. This image is really not good, but it's too late to do it. Drawings of local vernacular, flat roofs, and we're busy in this landscape at the moment. What's wonderful, we've been asked to do the strategic development framework for a 30-mile-long mountain range, which is about to be ruined by developers. And you have to fight that fight in your culture, and you're going to have to fight it, because otherwise you're going to completely destroy your places. But what happens is, in these mountains, you've got 27 churches, and you have to actually get on top here to access the churches. The churches of the Coptic faith that are carved in the negative out of the space, and there you're descending to one, and there you're inside one. And you've got the whole Coptic religion, which is another thing to deal with. It's the most magnificent, remember you're designing in the negative because you're taking away what's the positive space that you go into. And what we're doing in that particular thing is we've got some people who are moneyed who want to invest in a lodge, but the condition is that there's upliftment, there's a link to the local community with schools and health, and it's not just a matter of people coming to work into the lodge. In fact, they even have a 51% ownership over it. There are a lot of people in the world who've made a lot of money in emerging cultures, and they want to do something worthwhile with their lives, but they're intelligent enough to realize that you can't give things, people have got to earn them because then they value them. And these are Photoshop renderings done by my sons. They're a little bit crude, but you can actually see it becomes a very beautiful space to contemplate. And what happens is you've got mountains on all four sides of you. So if you have a pyramid type roof, you actually shut down the view, whereas here you can potentially get it. And then this is a diagram of a school we're hoping to get built. Again, it's the Ndebele idea of 3 detached pavilions around a courtyard, which has got a space where you pin up. And it's a result of a long conversation about what is the culture of the science and maths school. Africans have a difficulty with science and maths, and this is a wonderful initiative. And what we've proposed is it needs to go to a second floor, that we actually use our vaults at second floor level. So it does the wall and the roof in one, and that the central hall can be done like this. The local people can build it, and then you've actually just got a wing beam, and it's also rammed earth at the base. And then you get the diagonal extensions across courtyards, and the idea that a house is not a home unless it's a village. And what it does is it starts giving you those options and choices. We then move to Rwanda, a completely different culture, but when you get there, you recognize in the language, and you also recognize at the place of the kings. I was brought to do the State House for the president. I think they've got other priorities which they need to address. There's the place of the kings on the left-hand side. If I blindfolded a South African and took them there, they would think it was the Zulus. This is where the Zulus came from, and 600 years ago moved down the east coast of Africa. We looked at the idea of the tapestry in the land. We looked at the idea of a land with this is a classified project, so I can't talk about it. But what we are building at the moment is this cricket pavilion. We looked at the path of a bouncing ball, and it becomes a pavilion that overlooks 2 fields. It's for the Mali-born Cricket Club and David Cameron, who've put up money to introduce cricket into Rwanda. It's already established, but they have no facilities. And it's a charitable project. We sort of cutting ground at the moment. And then I'm going to just show you briefly how housing is really the big field that you need to look at. Because whenever we get involved with it, it's always at the top of the pyramid, and it's the people lower down who need it, and that's the field of interrogation. If you go to Rwanda, you can see wonderful examples of how when you get a village that's just grown naturally, it's along the top of the hill, it has a marketplace at its head, all these roofs collect water which you store. When you look at the way it goes along the contours or up and down the contours, you look at the compound that people form, you start learning about space making. We went and interrogated 25 families in a rural area. This is the steep slope they have. This is how they deal with their food. It's how they deal with their cattle. We then looked at the various typologies they've got, what the furniture is in those typologies, and how it grew incrementally, and then we took some of them and socially interrogated it a little bit further. These drawings are much better than they show on the screen. And then we went to an urban area where people, at great expense to themselves, have, through negotiation, illegally established themselves on sloping sites under the threat of the government removing them at any moment. And if you have a look at these drawings, you can see the amount of money they put into just making platform. And we also went into the city and interrogated city space making. And then I arrive home on Saturday, and on Sunday I've got to leave for a presentation in Kigali for a pre-feasibility on a scheme which is a first in East Africa because it's introducing Africans to the notion of living as urban people, not your own home on a plot. Rwanda's tiny. The genocide had to do with this, too many people, not enough space, one of the reasons, and they have no option but to design to an increased density. As this doesn't even read on the scheme. But as soon as you design to 100 units per hectare, you've got to share a common wall. We've got developers and bankers from South Africa who say we don't want to do that because we've never done it. We want to do American suburbia. So you stand up in the trenches and get shot down, but you've got to actually win the fight because the city and urban habitat are not going to allow a scheme that doesn't design to this density. You're also saying your city and yourself are saying Rwandans want an environment where you have rich and poor living side by side because that's what happens in the environment. The developers from South Africa are saying, oh, we prefer a gated suburb with rich houses because we can make a quicker buck. You've got to fight it. Okay? And you've got to stand up and fight or turn the job down. That's the stage that it gets to. And you've got to look at what in curtilage parking is. You've got to say to a developer, the infrastructure there, only 1/3 of 3,000 people can have cars. The rest have to use public transport. And it has to become legislated. And you have to park a car on site, and if you don't have a car, it can become an extension to your living room. This is not architecture. It's a pre-feasibility, and it's just looking at FAR, it's looking at coverage, and it's looking at you can give a cost. And you also know that a Rwandan, if you can give him a terrace on the second or third floor, it works. And then I didn't show this at 361. We won a contract at Axum, the most ancient city south of the Sahara in Africa, to do a thematic master plan. What happens in Ethiopia, everyone flies here to the city that's relatively new, and then you go on this tour, and by the time you've traveled 1,000 kilometers, you get to where it's really interesting, you spend the least amount of time and you come back. So what we're doing is we've revived the tourism route. Axum, 3,500 years ago, was an empire that stretched across to Oman and Yemen. It was part of the Sabian Empire. It was founded on teff, which is the richest cereal in the world. It's when Ethiopia had access to the Red Sea through Adula. It doesn't anymore because of various religious and other conflicts, which I won't go into. And, you know, you arrive in a situation like this. Again, it's another culture. It's not your culture. You have to interrogate German, British, Ethiopian, and Italian archaeologists. You have dinner with them separately because they don't talk to one another. And it's where, you know, pre-Christian, pre-Muslim, pre-Jew, and all of those groups borrowed and stole from one another. It's hilarious when you actually read about the process, and pillaged one another. And all the scriptures were based on basically the sun god Ra in Egypt, and they've all been interpretations of that, so it's very interesting to look at, which is why it's interesting to come to India, where more ancient cultures that aren't steeped in that are at play. But what you did at that time, you put a 500-ton single piece of stone on your head when you died if you were really important. And you carried it from 6 kilometers away. How did you move 500 tons of stone without breaking it? So it's amazing. You had the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, and the Axumite Empire. Okay? And we interrogated, and we found there were basically 3 squares that were linked. We had certain interventions that came in it. And then through a series of drawings, we made proposals for the tourism routes. But we realized when we did this project that the tourism was a pretext to get leverage to do something more important. You get 30,000 pilgrims coming here and there's no toilets. And you're not going to attract an American tourist who has to walk over every landmine every pace of the way. It became a health issue, and we're busy trying to deal with that at the moment. When a tourist comes to a place like this, what do they want? They want a clean toilet, they want a custodian of the site, which happens in your country very nicely, in the south at any rate. They want some information, and they want to sit in the shade. So they're very modest informations. These are the different routes: the Axumite route, the religious route of the Coptics, the Queen of Sheba route of the Jews, and the Solamite Empire and the interrogation of the old town. And then the drawings that take together civil engineering concerns of open sewers, re-establish the dignity of the stellar fields, give you some shade, give you some information carved on rock. A lot of World Heritage sites are ruined by bad signage, and some clean toilets. And then these dead stones, which are thrown bases that go along the route, instead of being mute, can become alive. And sometimes the intervention is just very, very small. It's moving some trees and putting a seat and doing some paving. And we started doing paving exercises. We found it's cheaper for them to make rock cobbles than it is to do anything else. And the Germans came and taught them, but they taught them the pattern like Nuremberg. So whenever the Germans went on holiday, we got them to do axamite paving. And then the Germans would come back and say, Gott im Himmel, and we got into big trouble. And then there were, a lot of it had to do with just defining an edge which is a scruffy edge, so it became user-friendly, and taking a site like this and maybe dealing with it in a different way. And at the moment, it's absolutely terrible. You arrive in like a car park. There's all these electric wires and things around. And how could you make it? How could you go back to the German expedition of 1906, which is beautifully documented? And how could you start making proposals? And how could a museum become a building which is invisible, which you hardly notice, which informs you before you go in? And then how further along could you actually have an exhibition of the beautiful documentation of the Germans in 1906? And then just in closure, this is the halfway mark between, this is the Valley of 1,000 Hills in Zululand. This is the halfway mark of a famous marathon between Durban and Pietermaritzburg, and this is a site that's been given for the conception of a women's center. There's the spring of a great river, which is part of the source. So you've got fire, you've got water, you've got sky, you've got those 5 things which occur also in the Hindu belief system. Now, what is an appropriate architecture, okay, in this particular context? And what is it allied to? I've got a meeting when I get back. This is the context. These happen to be pretty accurate photoshops. But, and what are the spaces you make when you go inside? We wanted to be built out of the earth. The Zulus are very in favor of that. So we'll take the same technology and explore it. Why the bent forms? Because it gives it structural rigidity. The idea that you actually come in and you spiral down and go past the exhibition, and then you go underneath and walk through an ambulatory, which has got light that actually penetrates the top as the drum comes through, which houses the archive, and then you go into something else. It's part of a dialogue. It's in process. The form of it might not be this. Attempts at looking at what that space can be, and if that's actually facing where the sun is, how can you make holes in to bring other light in other than the shaft of light? And when you get to the bottom, there's a stone, and there's hot water that you put on the stone, and steam goes into the air, and that's linked to Zulu culture. It's an initiative to house 3,000 tapestries which were made by women as embroideries, which tells the story of how they overcame conflict in their life. So it's the first women's museum in Africa. But it's become the center of the feminine principle through dialogue, and that extends to the environment and to endangered species. So the rhino, the elephant, how you actually deal with how nature's being violated by a sort of Newtonian, Descartesian thought. And these are some of the stories. This is where you actually come through from the main space and you go into the ambulatory. This is my drawing of how the shaft comes through, and it's just punctured by light. So it has to do with the sacred, it has to do with light, it has to do with building out of the earth, it has to do with people taking ownership through making, it has to do with working with the forces of the hyperbolic paraboloid, and that's where the dialogue is at present. And then in conclusion, there's just drawings. I just want to say to students that 90% of your experience spatially is based on the autobiography of who you are. You know, Peter Zumthor writes about the creaking floorboard of his grandmother influencing the design of a church. And he tells those stories, and he does the most beautiful poetic work. You haven't got that knowledge in the library of your computer. You've got it in the palm of your hand and your mind. And if you draw and you record, I arrived here tonight and I drew these steps, because steps like this have been like my dream. And we're going to the Sun Temple at 4 o'clock in the morning. It's going to be even nicer because the steps go sideways. When you draw in situ, it's sempere vedere. It's what the two words that Leonardo da Vinci used, and then Korb said, you know, you observe, and through observing you start gaining understanding, and then you start drawing the plan and the section, and then it becomes meaningful to you. When you go click, click with the camera, it doesn't become meaningful. Now you need to find out a way of gaining access. Drawing is also very quick. It happens very quickly, and as Korb says, unlike speaking, you can't lie through drawing, and it's very, very quick. And you need to develop that facility. Also, your intuition is your access to your source. And whether you're a Hindu or a Muslim or a Christian, it's also not in the library of your ingredients that are in your computer. So you're incredibly disadvantaged if you can't make your work personal, because you can't actually connect metaphysically with who you are or your culture is. You connect to a Revit program. And you know, you connect to a Revit program. Why does everyone who does Revit, they all look as though they're sponsored by Nike? They do these little roofs which are ticks. You know, architects are the only ones who do butterfly roofs. You never find it in the vernacular, because it's got a bit of a wow factor and it's sexy and it's different. Okay? And what you need to do is you need to become architects who don't do form. You need to read Kengo Kuma's book on anti-object. Form's easy. And the problem with the computer is that it forces you into making form decisions before you resolve the plan and the section. So you're putting yourself in incredible denial. It's a little bit like being on dope and being stupid half the time, because you can't actually think properly. So you need to really seriously think about how you bring you and your belief system and your Indianness or your New Zealandness or wherever you are into your work, through the autobiography of who you are and through where you are in the present. Because, you know, to quote Callao Cobran, your thoughts are on the world of tomorrow where we cannot go by virtue of our age, and the future's yours. And it's actually a much more exciting world you're going into than my generation was going into. Because the challenges that we've been fighting for are becoming accessible to you. And it's a good world. You go into Africa and you find some of the top students in the world are from Spain because of their education process. You arrive in the most godforsaken place in the middle, in the northern DRC, where a nice young girl from a European family shouldn't be, and you find the Spanish girls building a school there because she's not prepared to be twiddling her thumbs in Spain without any work. So you're suddenly getting enterprise that's happening, but she's also started a school of architecture, and she's also writing for a European magazine, and she suddenly got another job. So what's happening is you don't just qualify and you go and work for the hot shop designer architecture. You can actually make your own future, and you should think about your theses being things that can get built and can contribute to society, because you're going to maybe have to make your own. You seem to have a lot of work in India, but in some cultures you have to make your own work. So it's an incredibly exciting time. These are just drawings I did in the south of India when Lijay Remy, as a young architect in Trisha, took me to these absolutely incredible sites where elephants walk into temples and you're on water. The cameras, the projector's not very good. And I went and visited Larry Baker. And you know, if you're interested in materials, just go and serve an apprenticeship for 3 months at Larry Baker. Just find some time to take off. Go and work as a waitress or something, get some money and go and do it, because it'll teach you about the making of things and those beautiful palaces that you go to. And then in conclusion, you know, this is a plan of a Larry Baker house, which is very beautiful, because you arrive and you walk underneath the space, and that's an open courtyard, and it ventilates, and it comes around and it's got a portal entrance here. And then this is just a little section that was part of the Indian Institute of Management, and we were busy doing a building in Durban, and I did a drawing in it, and my son received it, and it was how you introduce at a double-story height in a tropical climate growth. And it came from homage to Doshi that he had done that very beautiful building. And you've got icons like Doshi, you've got, and Charles Correa, but you've got so much more. You've got such wonderful examples. Yatin gave me the Elements of Architecture book to look at today. Just everything you need to know as an architect. What is the floor? What is in that book. And I know prophets are not recognized in their own hometown, and all the educationists, Chai, everybody that I've actually met except, they're philosophers, they're sages, they're more than just educationists. So you've got the gift, in the palm of your hand. You just got to take it, and the world is waiting for you to show the way. Because India, the head of the management school in South Africa at Cape Town University, who worked in China, he's French, and he worked in India, wrote an article the other day and said, India is the place that's going to show the way. And we know what's happening in Africa. We've got to grapple with not dealing with being exploited in the second wave of imperialism, but become an activist. And it doesn't mean being irresponsible. It means being entirely responsible about doing something about your future in the context of the place that you're at. You were put in the place you're at for a reason. So even those students who are visiting from Europe and other places, you who you are at that point in time, but how can you make that work? How can you make the world a better place? And that's my closing comment to you, to believe in yourself. Don't be scared of your intuition. You've got to take risks. You've got to become an activist. You've got to learn when to say no. You've got to swim against the tide, and you've got to actually reclaim the environment and what architectural profession's given away at a point in time. Our generation gave it away. You've got to reclaim it back, and you've got to stand your ground on principle. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that very warm and inspiring lecture.